at the turn of the century wasn't just a crime. It was a slow-burning nightmare that an entire community failed to see. Even though the evidence was right in front of them, warm and fragrant, every single Saturday. Let's go back. Back to when trust was everything, and hunger made people blind. Winter arrived early in Ashford, Pennsylvania in 1889, bringing with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very soul of the town. Ashford was a coal mining community of about 800 people, nestled in the Allegheny Mountains, where the winters were always harsh, but that year proved merciless. The mine had reduced operations by half, leaving dozens of families without steady income, just as the cost of heating, fuel, and food climbed beyond reach. It was during this season of quiet desperation that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood appeared at the Saturday market. She came on the first Saturday of November, positioning her modest cart near the town square's oak tree, where the morning sun would warm her aging bones. She was perhaps 70 years old, though her exact age remained one of many mysteries about her. Her face was deeply lined, her posture slightly stooped, and she wore the traditional black mourning dress that suggested widowhood, a state she confirmed to anyone who asked, though she never elaborated on when or how her husband had passed. "Fresh meat pies," she announced in a voice that was surprisingly strong for someone so frail in appearance. 5 cents each, made with my grandmother's recipe. 5 cents was remarkably affordable. The local butcher, Mr. Garrett, charged 15 cents for a comparable pie, and his quality had declined as meat became scarce. People gathered around Mrs. Blackwood's cart with cautious interest, studying the golden-crusted pies that steamed gently in the cold morning air. Thomas Miller was the first to buy one. He was a broad-shouldered miner who had been working reduced hours and feeding a family of 6 on wages meant for 3. He took one bite and his eyes widened. "Lord have mercy," he breathed. "Ma'am, this is the finest pie I've ever tasted." Word spread quickly through the market. Within an hour, Mrs. Blackwood had sold all 24 pies she'd brought. People who had tasted them raved about the tender meat, the rich gravy, the perfect blend of seasonings that seemed to include herbs no one could quite identify, but everyone agreed were absolutely perfect. "Where do you source your meat?" asked Mr. Garrett, the butcher, with barely concealed professional jealousy. His own stock consisted mainly of gristle and questionable cuts that even he wouldn't feed his family. Mrs. Blackwood smiled gently, her pale blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "I have my ways, Mr. Garrett. Old connections from before I moved to Ashford. A woman learns to be resourceful when she's alone in the world." It was a non-answer, but delivered with such grandmotherly warmth that Garrett couldn't bring himself to press further. There was something about Mrs. Blackwood that discouraged interrogation, not hostility exactly, but a quiet firmness that suggested certain boundaries should not be crossed. The Ashford market was the social center of the community. Every Saturday, regardless of weather, farmers brought what produce they could coax from the rocky soil. Mrs. Chen sold preserves and dried goods. The Kowalski family offered bread that was increasingly more sawdust than flour as grain prices climbed. There was usually music. Peter O'Connor played his fiddle when his arthritis allowed, and children ran between the stalls while their parents conducted the slow, careful negotiations that survival demanded. Mrs. Blackwood integrated into this weekly ritual seamlessly. She was quiet, polite, and unfailingly punctual. She arrived each Saturday just after dawn, her cart pulled by an ancient mule that looked barely capable of the journey. By noon, her pies were always sold out. By early afternoon, she would pack her cart and depart, heading north on the old logging road that led deep into the forest. "Where does she live?" young Sarah Pritchard asked her father, who served as the town's unofficial record keeper. "Somewhere in the North Woods, I suppose," he replied, making a note in his ledger. "She's never said exactly, and I've never felt it appropriate to ask. Privacy is a precious thing, especially for a woman alone." Still, there were observations that a more suspicious community might have questioned. Mrs. Blackwood was never seen in town except on Saturdays. She didn't attend church services. She didn't shop at the general store or visit the post office. No one knew where she'd come from or when she'd arrived in the area. She simply appeared each week, sold her extraordinary pies, and vanished back into the woods like morning mist. But Ashford was struggling too desperately to worry about such details. What mattered was that Mrs. Blackwood's pies provided affordable, substantial meals for families who were increasingly going hungry. Reverend Morton praised her from the pulpit as an example of Christian charity. The mayor mentioned her in a town meeting as proof that neighborly kindness still existed even in hard times. "She's a blessing," declared Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house. "An absolute blessing sent to us when we needed it most." The first disappearance occurred 3 weeks after Mrs. Blackwood's arrival. James Rooker was a drifter, a man in his mid-40s, who had been sleeping in the church basement and doing odd jobs in exchange for meals. He was polite, hard-working, and kept mostly to himself, the kind of man who drifted through small towns like autumn leaves, leaving barely a trace of his presence. On a Tuesday morning, Reverend Morton found the basement door open and James's few possessions neatly arranged on the cot. But James himself was gone. His worn coat hung on its peg. His boots, barely held together with wire and hope, sat beside the bed. $3.15, his entire worldly wealth, remained in a small cloth bag under his pillow. "Odd," the Reverend murmured, but he didn't report it immediately. Drifters sometimes left suddenly. Perhaps James had received word of work elsewhere and departed in haste, planning to return for his things. But James never returned, and after a week, Reverend Morton mentioned it to Sheriff William Foster. Sheriff Foster was a practical man in his early 50s who had served Ashford for 20 years without encountering anything more serious than the occasional drunk and disorderly. He took a report, asked a few questions around town, and ultimately filed the matter away as transient departure, no further action required. 6 weeks later, in early January, Margaret Sullivan disappeared. Margaret was different from James Rooker. She was a known member of the community, a widow in her late 60s who lived alone in a small cottage near Willow Creek. She had no children, no close family, and survived on the charity of neighbors who brought her firewood and food. She was last seen on a Friday afternoon walking toward the woods with a basket, presumably to gather kindling for her stove. When she failed to appear at church on Sunday, Mrs. Henderson went to check on her. The cottage was unlocked, cold as a tomb, and completely empty. Margaret's Sunday dress hung neatly in the wardrobe. Her Bible sat on the bedside table. A half-finished knitting project lay across her chair. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone or why. This time, Sheriff Foster organized a proper search. 30 men combed the woods for 2 days, calling Margaret's name until their voices went hoarse, searching for any trace of the elderly woman. They found her empty basket near the creek, nothing more. "Could she have fallen in?" Deputy Thomas suggested. "The water's been running high with all the snow melt." They dragged the creek without result. The search eventually ended, and Margaret Sullivan joined James Rooker in the growing file of unsolved disappearances, a file that Sheriff Foster kept in his desk drawer and tried not to think about too often. What no one noticed, or if they noticed, they didn't comment, was that Mrs. Blackwood's pies had become even more popular. The meat seemed more tender, if that was possible. The portions were slightly larger, and that mysterious blend of seasonings had somehow become even more complex and satisfying. "She must have perfected her recipe," Mrs. Chen remarked to her husband, "or found an even better supplier." February brought snow that buried the town under 3 feet of white silence. It also brought 2 more disappearances. First was Daniel Wu, Mrs. Chen's elderly father-in-law, who suffered from confusion and often wandered. He went out one evening despite his daughter-in-law's protests, muttering about needing to check something in the garden. He never returned. Mrs. Chen's grief was compounded by guilt. She should have stopped him, should have watched him more carefully. The second was Robert Fletcher, a simple-minded young man of 20 who did odd jobs around town and was generally well-liked despite his limitations. He was last seen on the North Road, walking in the direction of the forest, though no one knew why he'd been heading that way or what might have drawn him. By March, Ashford had a problem that could no longer be ignored. 5 people had vanished in 4 months without a single trace. There was no pattern that made sense. The victims ranged from young to old, male to female, long-time residents to recent arrivals. The only common thread was that they were all somewhat marginalized, alone, poor or vulnerable in ways that left them with few people to notice their absence immediately. A town meeting was called on the first Saturday of March. The church hall was packed with anxious citizens demanding answers. Sheriff Foster stood before them looking exhausted. "I'm going to be honest with you," he began. "We have no leads, no witnesses, no evidence. It's possible these folks left of their own accord, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But 5 disappearances in 4 months is unusual. We're treating this as a serious matter and asking everyone to be vigilant. Travel in groups. Keep track of your neighbors. Report anything suspicious immediately." "What about wild animals?" someone called from the back. "Could be a rogue bear or a pack of wolves." "We've found no remains," Foster replied. "Wild animals leave evidence. Whatever's happening, it's not that simple." The meeting devolved into worried speculation. Some advocated for armed patrols. Others wanted to bring in investigators from Pittsburgh. A few whispered about darker possibilities, criminals, kidnappers, even some curse upon the town for unnamed sins. Through it all, Mrs. Blackwood sat quietly in the back row, her weathered hands folded peacefully in her lap, her expression one of gentle concern. If anyone had been watching her closely, they might have noticed that her eyes tracked across the crowd with unusual intensity, lingering on certain individuals, those who sat alone, those who looked particularly tired or weak, those who seemed disconnected from the community around them. But no one was watching Mrs. Blackwood. She was just the kind pie lady, a fixture of Saturday mornings, barely worth noticing beyond the exceptional food she provided. And that, though no one knew it yet, was exactly the problem. Spring arrived late in Ashford, and when it finally came, it brought little relief. The coal mine announced further reductions, cutting operations to just 3 days a week. Families that had been struggling now faced genuine starvation. The church soup kitchen, which Reverend Morton had expanded with donations from wealthier parishioners, could barely keep pace with the desperate need. Children developed the hollow eyes and distended bellies of malnutrition. Old people grew weaker, their bodies no longer able to fight the dual assault of hunger and cold. The town doctor, elderly Dr. Whitmore, made his rounds with a heavy heart, prescribing rest and nutrition to patients who had access to neither. In this desperate climate, Mrs. Blackwood's pies became more than just food. They became a lifeline. She increased her production steadily. Where she'd once brought 2 dozen pies to market, she now brought 4 dozen, then 6, then 8. The quality never faltered. The price remained an affordable 5 cents when everything else in town had doubled or tripled in cost. For many families, Mrs. Blackwood's Saturday pies represented the only substantial meal they would eat all week. "I don't understand it," Mr. Garrett the butcher admitted to Sheriff Foster one afternoon. They were standing outside Garrett's shop, watching the thin stream of customers who could still afford his prices. "Meat is scarce everywhere. I'm paying premium rates for scraps, but somehow that old woman has an endless supply of the finest quality I've ever seen. Where is she getting it?" Sheriff Foster had wondered the same thing. "Have you asked her directly?" "Half a dozen times. She always gives the same answer: old connections, family suppliers, resources from before she came to Ashford. Never anything specific." Garrett shook his head. "And here's what really bothers me. I've been in this business my whole life. I know every supplier within 100 miles. None of them have stock like what she's using. None of them could provide it at the volume she needs. It doesn't make sense. Maybe she raises animals herself, Foster suggested, though even as he said it, the explanation felt inadequate. A small farm somewhere in the woods. During winter, when everyone else's livestock was dying from cold and lack of feed. Garrett's skepticism was evident. And another thing, I've tried to replicate her pies. I've used the best meat I can find, tried every seasoning combination I know. I can't come close to her flavor. There's something in those pies I can't identify. The sheriff had no answers. He added Garrett's concerns to the growing list of oddities about Mrs. Blackwood, a list he reviewed late at night when sleep wouldn't come. The disappearances continued with terrible regularity. In April, 3 more people vanished. Sarah Pritchard's elderly aunt, who had been staying with the family but wandered off one afternoon, Michael Donnelly, an Irish immigrant who spoke limited English and worked occasional jobs at the mine, and young Timothy Fletcher, Robert's cousin, another simple-minded young man who had been devastated by Robert's disappearance and had become withdrawn and isolated. The pattern was becoming clearer to those willing to see it. Every victim was someone on the margins, too old, too foreign, too mentally impaired, too alone to be fully woven into the community's fabric. People whose absence created concern but not immediate crisis. People who might plausibly have wandered off or chosen to leave or met with some tragic accident that left no trace. Sheriff Foster was drowning under the weight of 8 unsolved disappearances. He'd written to the state police, requesting assistance, but their response was discouraging. Without evidence of foul play, without bodies, without witnesses, there was little they could do. People went missing all the time, especially during hard economic periods. The state simply didn't have resources to investigate every disappearance in every struggling town. Foster tried other approaches. He organized volunteer night watches with groups of men patrolling the streets after dark. He interviewed every resident multiple times, searching for connections or patterns. He spent days in the woods, walking the trails, looking for what? He didn't even know, but the forest kept its secrets, and the disappearances continued. It was Deputy Thomas who first voiced the suspicion that Foster himself had been avoiding. They were in the sheriff's office on a grey afternoon in early May. Rain drummed against the windows while they reviewed their notes, pages and pages of interviews, observations, dead ends. "Sheriff," Thomas said carefully, "I need to say something that's going to sound crazy." Foster looked up from his notes, seeing the worry in his deputy's young face. "Go ahead." "The disappearances, they all cluster around the weekends, specifically around market day." Thomas spread out his carefully maintained calendar. "Look, every single victim was seen at the Saturday market within a week of vanishing. Some the day they disappeared, others a few days before. But there's always that connection." Foster studied the calendar, his stomach sinking as he recognized the pattern. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting someone is using the market to select victims. Someone who's there every week, who can observe everyone, who can identify people who are vulnerable and alone." Thomas hesitated. "Someone who might be able to lure them somehow." They sat in silence for a long moment, both thinking about who attended the market every single Saturday without fail. Who would be in a position to observe everyone? Who had appeared in town just before the disappearances started? "Mrs. Blackwood," Foster said finally, the name feeling like lead on his tongue. "I know it sounds insane," Thomas said quickly. "She's just an old woman, a kind old woman who feeds half the town." "But Sheriff, what do we actually know about her? Where does she live? Where does she come from? How does she produce all those pies when everyone else can barely find scraps to survive on?" Foster stood and walked to the window, watching rain wash down the glass. "We can't accuse someone based on speculation, Thomas, especially not someone who's shown nothing but kindness to this community." "I'm not suggesting we accuse her. I'm suggesting we investigate her, quietly. Follow her home one Saturday, see where she lives, what her situation actually is. Maybe there's a perfectly innocent explanation for everything. And if there isn't, Thomas had no answer to that. They decided to wait until the following Saturday to observe Mrs. Blackwood more carefully. But fate, or perhaps something darker, intervened. On Thursday evening, a fire broke out in the building that housed the sheriff's office. It started in the back room where Foster kept his files and spread rapidly through the old wooden structure. Foster and Thomas barely escaped, grabbing what they could as flames consumed years of records. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the building was fully engulfed. They saved the neighboring structures but lost the office entirely. All of Foster's case files were destroyed. His notes on the disappearances, Thomas's calendar with its damning pattern, every interview and observation reduced to ash. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a faulty oil lamp. But Foster, standing in the smoking ruins the next morning, couldn't shake the feeling that it had been deliberately set, that someone had wanted those records destroyed, that someone had been watching them just as they'd planned to watch others. Saturday arrived with unseasonably warm weather. The market was crowded, people emerging from the long winter eager for fresh air and community. Mrs. Blackwood's stall, as always, was mobbed within minutes of her arrival. Foster and Thomas watched from a distance, trying to be inconspicuous as they observed her interactions with customers. They saw nothing suspicious, just an old woman selling pies, making polite conversation, moving slowly due to her age. But Foster noticed something he'd missed before. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes. They were pale blue and watery with age, but there was an intensity to them as they tracked across the crowd. She wasn't just serving customers, she was studying them, assessing them, noting who was alone, who looked weak, who might be struggling. When a thin, coughing man, a stranger passing through town, bought 3 pies and mentioned he was camping in the woods to save money on lodging, Foster saw Mrs. Blackwood's expression change subtly. Her smile widened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes brightened with something that might have been interest. "The North Woods have lovely spots for camping," she told the man kindly. "Follow the old logging road about 3 miles. There's a clearing by a stream. Very peaceful." The man thanked her and headed north, carrying his pies. Foster felt ice run through his veins. He started to follow the man, but Thomas grabbed his arm. "We can't intervene based on a feeling," the deputy whispered urgently. "We have no evidence, no proof of anything wrong. If we accuse her and we're mistaken, it'll destroy our credibility. No one will trust us again." Foster knew Thomas was right, but every instinct screamed at him to stop that man, to warn him, to do something. He did nothing. 3 days later, the stranger's campsite was found abandoned. His belongings were there, a bedroll, a small cooking pot, spare clothes. But the man himself had vanished completely, as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. That made 9. 9 people disappeared, 9 investigations that led nowhere, 9 families left with nothing but questions and grief. And all the while, Mrs. Blackwood's pies remained the best anyone had ever tasted, their rich flavor somehow deepening with each passing week, their availability seemingly endless despite the scarcity all around. Foster made a decision. The next Saturday, regardless of evidence or propriety or the risk to his reputation, he would follow Mrs. Blackwood home. He would see where she lived, how she lived, and discover once and for all the source of those impossible pies. But he made one critical mistake. He mentioned his plan to Reverend Morton, seeking the minister's counsel on the ethics of investigating someone without firm evidence. And Reverend Morton, who depended on Mrs. Blackwood's affordable pies to help feed his congregation, who had praised her publicly and considered her a blessing to the community, mentioned Foster's concerns to several parishioners, one of whom, Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, mentioned it to Mrs. Blackwood herself the very next day. "That sheriff is talking about following you home," Mrs. Henderson said with indignation. "Can you imagine? Such an invasion of privacy. I told him he should be ashamed, investigating a kind woman who's done nothing but help this town." Mrs. Blackwood smiled, her gentle grandmother smile. How troubling for him. The poor man is under such pressure. I understand completely. Perhaps I should speak with him, put his mind at ease. But she never did speak to Foster. Instead, that night, while the sheriff slept in his temporary room above the general store, a figure in black moved silently through the shadows. By morning, Sheriff William Foster was dead. Dr. Whitmore, examining the body, ruled it heart failure. Tragic but not uncommon in a man of Foster's age who had been under extreme stress. Only Deputy Thomas, looking at his mentor's peaceful face, wondered if a healthy man in his 50s really died of natural causes in his sleep. But without evidence, without proof, what could he say? The town buried Sheriff Foster with full honors. Reverend Morton delivered a eulogy praising his dedication. The entire community attended, genuinely grieving a good man who had tried his best in impossible circumstances. Mrs. Blackwood sat in the back of the church, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, the very picture of elderly sorrow. And the following Saturday, her pies, as always, sold out within hours. Deputy Thomas Miller became sheriff by default after Foster's death. At 28 years old, he was far too young for the responsibility and painfully aware of his inadequacy. But Ashford had no one else, and the state was unwilling to assign personnel to such a small, troubled town. Thomas moved into Foster's old room above the general store and spent his nights staring at the ceiling, trying to silence the voice in his head that whispered murder every time he thought about his predecessor's death. He had no proof. Dr. Whitmore had been certain. Heart failure, pure and simple. Foster had been under tremendous stress, had lost weight, had been drinking more than usual. His heart had simply given out. But the timing troubled Thomas. Foster had been planning to investigate Mrs. Blackwood, and within days of that plan becoming public knowledge, he was dead. Coincidence? Possibly. Probably. Thomas tried to convince himself of that as May turned to June and the disappearances continued. 2 more in June. Elderly Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen's father-in-law, who had been failing for months, and a young woman named Rachel Morrison, who had recently arrived in town seeking work. Both last seen near the Saturday market. Both vanished without a trace. 11 people now. 11 lives erased as if they'd never existed. The town was paralyzed with fear. Parents kept children close. People traveled in groups even during daylight. The market attendance dropped sharply as residents chose hunger over the risk of being noticed, being selected, being next. But those who did attend, and necessity forced many to continue, found Mrs. Blackwood in her usual spot, calm and smiling, her cart laden with pies that smelled like salvation itself. Thomas attended every market, watching her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He noted every interaction, every customer, every word she spoke. He was looking for something, anything, that might justify his suspicions. What he found instead was a woman who seemed genuinely kind. She gave free pies to families who couldn't afford them. She asked after people's health. She offered words of comfort to those who were struggling. Children ran to her cart, and she would tousle their hair and slip them small treats from her pocket. Could a monster be so gentle? Thomas wondered. Or was gentleness simply another tool in a predator's arsenal? It was a newcomer who finally provided the break Thomas had been desperately seeking. Her name was Elizabeth Crane, and she arrived in Ashford on a Tuesday in mid-June, riding the afternoon train from Pittsburgh. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in practical traveling clothes with intelligent dark eyes and a leather satchel that never left her side. She introduced herself to Thomas as a private investigator. "I specialize in missing persons cases," she explained, sitting across from him in his small office. "I've been following the reports about Ashford. 11 disappearances in 7 months. That's extraordinary and troubling. We've had no success finding them," Thomas admitted, grateful for someone who might actually understand the magnitude of the problem. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence of any kind. That's because you've been looking in the wrong places, Elizabeth said. She opened her satchel and pulled out a thick file. I've investigated similar cases in 3 other towns over the past 5 years. Different states, different circumstances, but certain patterns that are consistent. She spread photographs across Thomas's desk. He leaned forward, studying them with growing unease. They showed an elderly woman in black. Different women, he thought at first, but there was something similar about them. The posture, the style of dress, the way they stood at market stalls or on street corners. These are all different people, Thomas said slowly. Are they? Elizabeth pulled out another photograph, this one older and more faded. This was taken in Ohio in 1883. The woman called herself Mrs. Whitfield. She appeared in a small mining town during an economic depression. She sold baked goods at the local market, cheap, high quality, impossibly abundant despite widespread scarcity. She pulled out another photo. This is from West Virginia, 1885. Mrs. Hartley. Same pattern. Appeared during hard times. Sold exceptional food products. Vanished after a series of disappearances rocked the community. A third photo. Pennsylvania, different town, 1887. Mrs. Pemberton, same story. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. You're saying these are all the same woman? I'm saying there's a pattern. An old woman appears in a struggling community. She sells food that's somehow better and cheaper than anything else available. People start disappearing, always the vulnerable, always the marginal members of society. Eventually something happens. Sometimes she's discovered. Sometimes she simply vanishes before anyone grows too suspicious. Then she appears somewhere else under a different name. Thomas struggled to process it. That's impossible. These photos span 6 years. The woman would have to be very old, yes, but not impossibly so. Elizabeth pulled out one final photograph, this one significantly older, from 1875. I believe this might be her as well, a Mrs. Ashford, in Maryland. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Ashford, as in the same name as this town. Yes, I noticed that too. Elizabeth's expression was grim. I think she chooses names deliberately. Sometimes it's the town name. Sometimes it's a previous identity. It's part of her pattern, hiding in plain sight, becoming so ordinary that no one really sees her. Thomas's hands were shaking as he reached for the photographs. Who is she? What is she? I don't know her real identity, but I know what she does. Elizabeth met his eyes directly. She preys on communities in crisis. She offers help, sustenance, comfort. And she uses that position to select victims, people who won't be immediately missed, whose disappearances can be explained away. She's been doing this for at least 15 years that I can document, possibly much longer. But why? What does she... Thomas stopped, unable to voice the terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Elizabeth voiced it for him. The food she sells, the pies, the baked goods. They're always described the same way, exceptionally tender meat, rich flavor, mysterious seasonings, and they're always abundant when meat is scarce everywhere else. The implication hung in the air between them, too monstrous to speak aloud. I need proof, Thomas said finally, something concrete, because if I accuse her without evidence, this town will tear me apart. She's beloved here. She's fed people through the worst winter in memory. Then we'll get proof, Elizabeth said. This Saturday, I'll attend the market as just another customer. I'll buy her pies, and then I'll follow her home and see what she's really doing out there in those woods. Thomas wanted to warn her that the last person who'd planned to investigate Mrs. Blackwood, Sheriff Foster, was now dead, but Elizabeth seemed capable, prepared, and far more experienced than Thomas himself. If anyone could uncover the truth, perhaps it was her. Saturday arrived with brilliant sunshine that felt almost mocking given the darkness gathering over Ashford. Elizabeth attended the market dressed inconspicuously, just another face in the crowd. She bought 2 pies from Mrs. Blackwood, engaged in brief, pleasant conversation, and then withdrew to observe from a distance. Thomas watched from his own vantage point, trying not to be obvious about his surveillance. When the market ended, and Mrs. Blackwood packed her cart, Elizabeth followed at a careful distance. Thomas waited 5 minutes, then followed as well, staying far enough back that he wouldn't be spotted but close enough to intervene if necessary. The north road led into increasingly dense forest. Mrs. Blackwood's ancient mule plodded along at a steady pace, the cartwheels leaving clear tracks in the soft earth. Elizabeth maintained her distance expertly, using the trees for cover. Thomas, less experienced, felt clumsy and obvious, despite his best efforts at stealth. After nearly 3 miles, Mrs. Blackwood turned off the main road onto a narrow path that was barely visible through the undergrowth. Elizabeth followed without hesitation. Thomas approached the turnoff more cautiously. He could no longer see either woman ahead of him. The forest here was thick and dark, the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. He followed the path for another 10 minutes before he smelled it. It was faint at first, something sweet and rotten underlying the normal forest scents of earth and pine. As he continued forward, it grew stronger, making his stomach clench and his throat tighten. The path opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a ramshackle cottage that looked barely habitable, sagging roof, cracked walls, a single grimy window. Behind it was a larger structure, a storage shed perhaps, with a heavy door secured by a substantial padlock. Mrs. Blackwood's cart stood empty near the cottage. The old woman herself was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Elizabeth. Thomas's hand went to his revolver as he approached the clearing cautiously. Everything was silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and that terrible smell growing stronger with every step. He was halfway to the cottage when he heard the scream. It came from the shed, a woman's voice, high and terrified, cut off abruptly. Thomas ran. He reached the shed and yanked at the padlock, but it held firm. The screaming had stopped, replaced by sounds of struggle from inside. Thuds, crashes, desperate gasps. "Elizabeth!" he shouted, then aimed his revolver at the padlock and fired. The lock shattered. Thomas yanked the door open and immediately staggered backward, his hand clamped over his mouth and nose. The smell that poured out was overwhelming. Decay and chemicals and something else, something that spoke to the deepest, most primitive part of his brain and screamed danger, death, run. His eyes adjusted to the dimness inside, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elizabeth was on the floor, struggling weakly. Standing over her was Mrs. Blackwood, but she no longer looked frail or gentle. She held a heavy iron poker in both hands, raised to strike again. And beyond them, in the shadows of the shed, Thomas glimpsed things that made his mind rebel against understanding. Shapes hanging from hooks, tables with tools arranged with terrible precision, barrels that— "Don't look," Elizabeth gasped. "Thomas, don't—" Mrs. Blackwood turned toward him, and her face was transformed. Gone was the kindly grandmother. What remained was something cold and calculating, with eyes that assessed him the way a farmer might assess livestock. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice still pleasant despite the circumstances. "This didn't have to involve you." Thomas raised his revolver with shaking hands. "Step away from her." "Or what? You'll shoot an old woman?" Mrs. Blackwood smiled. "What will the town think of their young sheriff then, especially when they learn you broke into my property and tried to harm me? They'll know the truth when they see—" Thomas gestured toward the interior of the shed, unable to put into words what he'd glimpsed. "Will they? Or will they simply see the ramblings of an inexperienced boy who let grief and stress make him paranoid?" She took a step toward him. "Sheriff Foster trusted the wrong people too. Look where it got him." It was a confession, or close enough. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but Elizabeth moved faster than he would have thought possible given her injuries. She swept Mrs. Blackwood's legs out from under her, sending the old woman crashing to the ground. "Run!" Elizabeth shouted. "Get help! Don't let her—" Mrs. Blackwood rolled with surprising agility and grabbed Elizabeth's ankle. The two women struggled, but Elizabeth was injured and weakening. Thomas had seconds to make a choice. He could try to help Elizabeth in close-quarters combat, possibly giving Mrs. Blackwood an advantage. Or he could run for help, leaving Elizabeth alone with a woman who had apparently killed at least a dozen people. He ran. Not out of cowardice, though it would haunt him regardless, but because he needed witnesses, needed backup, needed people to see what was in that shed before Mrs. Blackwood could hide or destroy the evidence. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, branches whipping his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps, expecting at any moment to hear a gunshot from behind him. He reached town in less than 20 minutes, a journey that normally took an hour. He burst into the general store where a handful of men were gathered, all of them staring at his wild-eyed appearance. "I need everyone," he gasped. "Weapons, lanterns, now. I found where the missing people went. I found—" He couldn't finish. "Please, trust me. We need to go now." Perhaps it was the raw desperation in his voice. Perhaps it was the blood on his shirt from thorns and branches. Perhaps it was simply that they wanted answers after months of fear. 10 men armed themselves and followed Thomas back into the woods. They found the clearing exactly as he'd left it. The cottage stood silent. The shed door hung open. Inside, they found Elizabeth Crane, barely conscious but alive. Mrs. Blackwood was gone. And what else they found in that shed? What Thomas had only glimpsed but they now saw fully, made several grown men vomit and others simply sink to their knees in horror. Because the truth about Mrs. Blackwood's pies, the source of all that tender meat and rich flavor, was no longer a mystery. It was written in the evidence that filled that terrible shed, evidence that would take days to fully process and weeks to accept. Evidence that meant the entire town of Ashford had been unknowingly participating in an atrocity for 7 months. The screaming, when it started, seemed like it would never stop. The men who entered that shed on June 15, 1890, were forever changed. They emerged pale and shaking, several needing to be physically supported by their companions. 2 of them, experienced hunters who had dressed hundreds of deer and never flinched, simply sat on the ground and wept. Thomas directed them to collect evidence while he stayed with Elizabeth, who had suffered a severe blow to the head and injuries to her ribs. Dr. Whitmore was summoned and treated her while the grim work continued. No one spoke about what they found. Not yet. They couldn't find the words. Mrs. Blackwood had vanished completely. A search party scoured the surrounding woods for hours, but found no trace of her. It was as if she'd simply dissolved into the forest like morning fog. "She's gone," Thomas told the gathered men as darkness fell. "But we have evidence, we have proof, and we need to tell the town what we've discovered." They returned to Ashford as night settled over the valley. Thomas called an emergency meeting in the church, the only building large enough to hold the entire adult population. By 9 o'clock, every resident who could walk had crowded into the pews and aisles. The mood was tense, confused, frightened. Rumors had already spread, wild speculation about what had been found, who was responsible, what it meant. Thomas stood at the front, his young face aged by what he'd witnessed. Beside him were the 10 men who had entered the shed, each bearing the weight of knowledge they wished they could unknow. "I'm going to tell you something terrible," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Something that will change how you see this town, your neighbors, and yourselves. I need you to listen completely before you react." He told them about Elizabeth Crane's investigation, about the pattern she'd uncovered across multiple towns and years. about the woman who appeared in struggling communities under different names, always offering the same help, always leaving behind the same trail of disappearances. He told them about following Mrs. Blackwood to her cottage, about the shed behind it, about what they'd found inside. He didn't describe it in detail. He couldn't, and there was no need. The implications were clear enough. The 11 people who vanished, he said quietly, they didn't leave town. They didn't have accidents. They were taken. And they were... He stopped, unable to continue. One of the other men stepped forward. It was Michael O'Brien, a father of 4 who had bought Mrs. Blackwood's pies every week to feed his family. They were butchered, O'Brien said, his voice hollow. In that shed, like animals. And then he looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people he'd known his entire life. The pies, all those pies we ate, all those months, that's where the meat came from. The church erupted, screaming, crying, people doubled over, retching, mothers clutching children, men shouting denials. The sound was primal, a collective howl of horror and revulsion that seemed to shake the very walls. Thomas let it continue for several minutes before firing his revolver into the air. The gunshot brought silence, broken only by sobbing. "I know this is unbearable," he said. "I know many of you feel sick, violated, complicit, but you were victims too. You were deceived by a woman who was exceptionally good at deception. She targeted this community deliberately, knowing that hunger and desperation would make you grateful for help without asking too many questions." "How could we not have known?" someone cried out. It was Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, her face streaked with tears. "How could we eat that and not know what it was?" "Because she was skilled," Elizabeth Crane said. "She had insisted on attending despite her injuries, her head wrapped in bandages. I've tracked her for years. She knows exactly how to prepare the meat so it's indistinguishable from pork or beef. She uses specific seasonings, cooking methods. People in other towns described the same thing, the best pies they'd ever tasted, with a flavor they couldn't quite identify." "Where is she now?" demanded Mr. Garrett, the butcher. His face was ashen. He'd been jealous of Mrs. Blackwood's success, had tried to replicate her recipes. The irony was crushing. "Gone," Thomas admitted. "We're searching, but she knows these woods far better than we do. She may have other hiding places. She's evaded capture before." "She needs to hang," someone shouted, and others took up the cry. "When we find her, she hangs." Thomas understood the rage, shared it even, but he also understood that mob justice would help no one. "If we find her, she'll face proper trial and punishment," he said firmly. "But right now we have other concerns. We need to identify the remains we found, give the families closure. We need to contact authorities and make sure this information reaches other communities so she can't do this again somewhere else." "What about..." Mrs. Chen's voice was barely audible. "My father-in-law, is he..." Thomas nodded slowly. "We believe so, Mrs. Chen. I'm so sorry." The grief that filled the church then was profound and complex. These families had lost their loved ones twice, once when they disappeared, and again when they learned what had become of them. And layered over that grief was the horrible knowledge that they had unknowingly consumed those very people they mourned. It was a violation of the deepest taboo, a trauma that would scar the entire community for generations. Over the following days, the grim work continued. Dr. Whitmore, with assistance from a specialist brought in from Pittsburgh, examined the remains found in the shed. Some could be identified through clothing or personal effects. Others were too far gone. They confirmed 11 victims, matching the 11 disappearances. Each family was notified privately, though there was no real privacy in a town as small as Ashford. Everyone knew who had lost someone. Everyone carried the same burden of knowledge. Proper burials were arranged, or as proper as possible given the circumstances. Reverend Morton conducted the services, though his faith was clearly shaken. His sermon spoke of forgiveness and healing, but his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had stared into an abyss. Elizabeth Crane, once recovered enough to travel, left Ashford to continue her pursuit of the woman she'd been hunting. She took copies of all the evidence, photographs of the shed's contents, witness statements. "She'll surface again," Elizabeth told Thomas before departing. "Women like her always do. They can't stop. It's not just about survival, it's about the power, the control. She'll find another struggling town, take another identity, and start again." "How do we warn people?" Thomas asked. "How do we make sure this doesn't happen elsewhere?" "We spread the word. We alert law enforcement across multiple states. We publish the story." Elizabeth's expression was grim. "Though honestly, I'm not sure it will help. She's been doing this for so long because she's careful, patient. She only appears when communities are desperate enough to not ask hard questions. And there are always desperate communities." After Elizabeth left, Thomas found himself effectively leading a town that was falling apart. People couldn't eat. The mere thought of food, any food, triggered violent nausea in many residents. Children grew thinner as parents struggled to force down enough sustenance to survive. Dr. Whitmore prescribed tonics and rest, but there was no medicine for this particular ailment. Those who could afford to leave did so. The Kowalskis closed their bakery and moved to their daughter's home in Ohio. The Chen family returned to California. Families who had lived in Ashford for generations packed their belongings and departed for anywhere that wasn't tainted by these memories. The town's population dropped by a third within 2 months. Those who remained existed in a state of collective trauma. They avoided eye contact. They stopped gathering socially. The market continued, but it was a shadow of what it had been. Sparse, silent, joyless. Mr. Garrett, the butcher, tried to continue his business, but no one would buy from him. The association with meat, with butchering, with anything related to what had happened was too strong. He closed his shop in August and took work at the mine instead. Mrs. Henderson tried to maintain her boarding house, but travelers who heard the story of Ashford refused to stop there. Eventually she converted it into a private residence for herself alone, living in one room of the large building, the rest slowly decaying around her. Reverend Morton continued holding services, but attendance dwindled. How could people worship a God who had allowed such horror? How could they pray for forgiveness when they felt they needed to be forgiven for something they'd done unknowingly? By September, he stopped trying. The church stood empty except for the ghosts of 11 victims whose names were carved into a memorial Thomas had commissioned, a simple stone marker that listed the dead: James Rooker, Margaret Sullivan, Daniel Wu, Robert Fletcher, Henry Chen, Rachel Morrison, Sarah Pritchard, Michael Donnelly, Timothy Fletcher, William Foster, unknown traveler. Thomas visited that memorial every day. He'd failed to protect these people, failed to see the threat hiding in plain sight. The fact that he'd eventually uncovered the truth felt like cold comfort when measured against 11 lost lives. In October, he received a letter from Elizabeth Crane. She'd traced Mrs. Blackwood, or whatever her real name was, to a town in Indiana. By the time Elizabeth arrived, the woman had already disappeared, but the pattern was there. An elderly widow selling exceptional baked goods during an economic crisis. 3 people had already gone missing. "She's still out there," the letter concluded, "still hunting, still feeding on communities too desperate to question their good fortune. I'll keep searching, but Thomas, there may be dozens of towns like Ashford, dozens of communities carrying this same secret shame. We may never know the full extent of what she's done." Thomas folded the letter carefully and added it to his growing file on the case, a file he maintained obsessively, despite knowing it was unlikely Mrs. Blackwood would ever face justice. Winter arrived early that year, as if the seasons themselves mourned what had happened in Ashford. The first snow fell in November, covering the town in white that felt less like purity than burial. On a cold December morning, Thomas stood in the empty market square, remembering how it had been a year ago. The crowds, the laughter, the sense of community, the smell of Mrs. Blackwood's pies, drawing people like moths to flame. All gone now, destroyed by a monster who had worn the face of kindness. He was still standing there when Mrs. Chen approached, one of the few original residents who had chosen to stay. "Sheriff Thomas," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about leaving, going back to my family in California, but I wanted to ask your opinion first." "Why stay?" Thomas asked honestly. "There's nothing left here but bad memories." "That's just it," Mrs. Chen said. "If everyone leaves, if we all scatter and try to forget, then those 11 people are forgotten too. Their deaths become just a story, something horrible that happened once. But if we stay, if we remember, if we carry this with us, then maybe their lives meant something. Maybe the lesson of what happened here serves some purpose." Thomas had never considered it that way. What lesson? That evil can hide anywhere? That hungry people can't afford suspicion? That sometimes the help we desperately need comes with a price too terrible to imagine? All of that, Mrs. Chen agreed. And also that we're capable of surviving even the worst revelations about ourselves, that we can carry unbearable knowledge and still continue. That's worth something, isn't it? Thomas wasn't sure, but he stayed anyway because someone needed to remember. Someone needed to maintain the records, to answer questions if they came, to make sure that what happened in Ashford was documented and real and not just a cautionary tale that people half believed. He stayed, and Mrs. Chen stayed, and a handful of others stayed, and slowly, very slowly, life continued. Not the same life as before, that was impossible, but a different kind of life, built on the ruins of innocence and trust, constructed from the materials of survival and stubborn refusal to let evil have the final word. And every day, Thomas walked to that memorial and read the names of the 11 people who had been taken from a community too desperate to see the predator among them. He read their names and remembered, because someone had to, because forgetting would be the final betrayal. The town of Ashford, Pennsylvania, limped through the winter of 1890-1891 like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The population continued to decline, down to less than 400 souls by spring, as families who had clung to hope finally admitted defeat and departed for new lives elsewhere. Those who remained were the stubborn, the poor, or the broken, people who had nowhere else to go, or who felt some obscure obligation to stay and bear witness to what had happened. Thomas Miller, still serving as sheriff despite having almost no one to protect, maintained his vigil. He kept meticulous records of everything: the investigation, the evidence, the aftermath. He corresponded with Elizabeth Crane, who continued tracking the woman she believed was Mrs. Blackwood across the Midwest, always arriving just after she'd vanished. In April, Thomas received a letter that made his hands shake as he read it. It was from a sheriff in Iowa, responding to one of the many inquiries Thomas had sent to law enforcement agencies across the country. The Iowa sheriff had encountered a case similar to Ashford's in a town called Millstone. An elderly woman selling exceptional baked goods during hard times, a series of disappearances, and a horrifying discovery when authorities finally investigated her isolated farmhouse. But there was a difference. In Millstone, they had caught her. The woman gave her name as Mrs. Harriet Thorne, the letter read. "She is currently awaiting trial. Given the similarities to your case, I thought you might wish to attend the proceedings. If this is indeed the same individual, your testimony could be valuable." Thomas boarded a train to Iowa 3 days later. The trial was held in a small courthouse in Cedar Rapids, the county seat nearest to Millstone. Thomas arrived a week before proceedings began and spent that time speaking with the Iowa sheriff and the prosecutor, sharing his documentation from Ashford. When he finally saw the defendant, brought into the courtroom in chains, Thomas felt his breath catch. She looked different. Her hair was darker, her posture more stooped, her clothing shabbier. But the eyes were the same. those pale blue, assessing eyes that had measured countless victims and found them wanting. She saw Thomas in the gallery, and her expression didn't change. No recognition, no fear. Nothing but that same calm evaluation, as if he was simply another person she was cataloguing for future reference. The trial lasted 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming. The remains of 7 people found on her property, tools and materials that confirmed the horrible use to which those remains had been put, testimony from Millstone residents who had unknowingly consumed her products. The defense attorney, a young man who looked sick throughout the proceedings, could only argue that his client was mentally incompetent, that no sane person could commit such acts. Therefore, she must be insane and should be institutionalized rather than executed. The prosecution called Thomas as a witness on the 2nd day. He testified about Ashford, about the 11 victims there, about the identical pattern of behavior. He presented his documentation, photographs, reports, the memorial stone's inscription. When he finished, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The judge, an elderly man who had presided over hundreds of cases, had tears in his eyes. "Are there more?" the judge asked quietly. "More towns? More victims?" "We believe so, Your Honor," Thomas replied. "We've documented similar cases across at least 6 states over 15 years. The true number may never be known." For the first time, the defendant spoke. Her voice was clear and unconcerned. 37. She said. The courtroom erupted. The judge gavelled for order while the defendant sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap. "What did you say?" the prosecutor demanded. 37 towns, she repeated, over 42 years, though some were hardly worth counting, just a few people here and there. Others were more productive. She looked directly at Thomas. "Ashford was one of my more successful ventures. 11 in 7 months, quite efficient." The horror of her casual tone was somehow worse than the content of her words. She spoke about human lives the way a merchant might discuss inventory. "How many people?" the prosecutor asked, though Thomas could see the man didn't really want to know the answer. The defendant, Thomas refused to think of her by any of her false names, tilted her head as if calculating. "I stopped counting years ago. Several hundred, certainly, perhaps approaching 1,000. I'd have to review my records." "You kept records?" The prosecutor's voice was strangled. "Of course. How else would I refine my methods? Each town taught me something new. Which seasonings worked best, how to select victims who wouldn't be missed, the optimal timing between acquisitions." She smiled slightly. "I'm very good at what I do." The defense attorney moved for a mistrial, arguing that his client's statements proved her insanity, but the judge denied the motion. "I've seen many things in my years on the bench," the judge said, "but I've never encountered evil quite so calculating. This woman is not insane. She knows exactly what she's doing and has been doing it with deliberate precision for decades. Insanity would be a mercy she hasn't earned." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. Throughout the sentencing, the defendant showed no emotion. When asked if she had any final statement, she simply said, "I did what was necessary to survive. That's all any creature does." She was executed 3 weeks later on a grey morning in May. Thomas attended, feeling it was his duty to represent the 11 victims from Ashford. She walked to the gallows with steady steps, showing no fear or remorse. Her last words, spoken clearly to the assembled witnesses, were chilling in their simplicity. "There are others like me. You just haven't found them yet." Then the trap door opened, and she fell. Thomas remained in Iowa for another week, working with authorities to document everything the woman had left behind. Her cottage in Millstone yielded records, meticulously kept journals detailing 42 years of murder. Reading them was like descending into hell. She had indeed operated in 37 different towns, always following the same pattern, always appearing during economic hardship, always offering help, always selecting victims carefully, always disappearing before suspicion could solidify into accusation. Ashford wasn't even the worst. In a Kentucky town in 1873, she'd operated for nearly 2 years and killed 23 people before vanishing. In Michigan in 1880, she'd killed 16. In Missouri in 1885, 19. The journals also revealed her real name, or at least the name she'd been born with, Margaret Ann Grayson, born in 1822 in Massachusetts. Her husband had been a butcher who taught her the trade. When he died in 1848, leaving her destitute with 3 children to feed, she had made a choice that set her on this terrible path. Her first victim had been a drifter who came begging for food. She killed him, butchered him with the skills her husband had taught her, and fed him to her starving children. When they survived, when no one suspected, when she realized how easy it had been, she continued. The children died young of various illnesses, according to the journals. She noted their deaths with the same clinical detachment she used for everything else. After they were gone, she had no reason to stop. The practice had become her livelihood, her identity, her purpose. For 42 years, she had moved through America like a plague, feeding on the vulnerable and the desperate, hiding behind the face of grandmotherly kindness. Thomas brought copies of the journals back to Ashford. He read them to the remaining residents in a series of meetings held at the church. People needed to know, needed to understand that they hadn't been uniquely foolish or blind. That this woman had perfected her craft over decades, fooling hundreds of communities, killing hundreds of people. It helped somewhat. The knowledge that Ashford was not alone in its victimization eased some of the collective shame, but it didn't erase it. Nothing could do that. By the summer of 1891, Ashford had stabilized at around 300 residents. Those who remained had made their peace as much as possible with what had happened. They had learned to eat again, though many developed restrictions: no pies, no unfamiliar meat, nothing that reminded them too strongly of that terrible time. The market reopened, but it was different. People bought necessities and left quickly. There was no music, no socializing, no joy. It was purely transactional. Thomas continued as sheriff, though his duties were minimal. He spent most of his time maintaining the memorial, corresponding with other communities that had been victimized, and working with Elizabeth Crane to document the full extent of Margaret Grayson's crimes. Elizabeth visited Ashford twice more over the following years. She had made it her life's work to identify all of Grayson's victims and notify their families. It was grim, thankless work, but she pursued it with quiet determination. "Someone needs to remember them," she told Thomas during her last visit in 1893. "Someone needs to say their names and acknowledge what was done to them. Otherwise, she wins. She reduces them to nothing more than meat, and that can't be the end of their stories." Thomas understood. That's why he stayed in Ashford long after he could have left for a better position elsewhere. Someone needed to maintain the record. Someone needed to remember. He served as sheriff until 1910, when age and failing health finally forced him to retire. By then, Ashford had shrunk to barely 100 residents. The mine had closed permanently. The church held services only once a month. The market had dwindled to a handful of vendors selling to a handful of customers, but the memorial remained, and Thomas visited it every day until his death in 1912. Mrs. Chen stayed as well, outliving most of her generation. She kept a small garden and maintained a quiet correspondence with her family in California, but she never left Ashford. When asked why, she would simply say, "Someone needs to remember." The town finally died in the 1920s. The last residents departed, leaving behind empty buildings and empty streets. Nature slowly reclaimed what humans had abandoned. Vines growing over storefronts, trees pushing through floorboards, the forest gradually erasing the evidence that a community had ever existed there. Only the memorial remained visible, standing in what had once been the town square. Weather and time wore at the inscribed names, but they remained legible for decades. In 1952, a historian researching ghost towns in Pennsylvania stumbled across the ruins of Ashford. Following local legends about a cursed town, she found the memorial stone and spent months researching what had happened there. Her published account brought brief attention to the case. Newspapers ran stories about the monster of Ashford and America's most prolific serial killer. For a few weeks, the case was discussed in academic circles and true crime publications. Then it faded again, as these things do. New horrors replaced old ones in the public consciousness. But the memorial remained, and occasionally, even now more than a century later, someone stumbles across it in the woods where Ashford used to be. They read the names of 11 people who vanished in 1889 and 1890. They might wonder about the story behind those names. A few might research and discover the truth. Most will simply take a photograph and move on, unaware that they're standing in the ruins of a community that learned the hardest lesson of all, that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and rage. Sometimes it arrives quietly, offering help when help is desperately needed. Sometimes it wears a kind face and speaks gentle words. Sometimes it bakes pies that smell like heaven and taste like salvation. And sometimes, too often, we're so hungry that we don't ask where the food came from until it's far too late. The names on that memorial are a warning, if anyone cares to read them. A reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones we fear in the dark. They're the ones we welcome into our lives because we're too desperate to question our good fortune.